On a crisp autumn evening, when the streetlights were just beginning to flicker on and cast long shadows across the quiet suburban roads, the newly appointed police chief of Millbrook County was heading home. He'd spent the entire day doing what he loved most, connecting with the community he'd sworn to serve and protect. His dark blue sedan moved smoothly through the residential streets, the radio playing softly in the background as he reflected on the day's community outreach meeting. The police chief had purposely chosen to drive his personal car and wear civilian clothes, a simple brown leather jacket over a white shirt and dark jeans. After 25 years in law enforcement, he knew the value of observing his new jurisdiction without the weight of his uniform and badge announcing his presence. The community meetings had gone well, with local residents sharing their concerns about neighborhood safety, traffic issues, and the need for more youth programs. He smiled, thinking about the elderly woman who'd brought homemade cookies to the meeting and the passionate high school student who'd presented ideas for a police youth mentorship program. These were the moments that reminded him why he'd joined the force all those years ago, to make a real difference in people's lives. The streets were relatively empty at this hour, with only the occasional car passing by and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the neighborhood. The police chief checked his watch, just past 9:30 p.m. His wife had texted earlier, asking if he'd pick up some milk on his way home, and he was planning to stop at the convenience store a few blocks ahead. As he approached an intersection, he noticed the flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. At first, he assumed the patrol car was responding to an emergency call and would pass him, but the lights stayed steady behind his vehicle. Puzzled, he checked his speedometer. He'd been going exactly the speed limit. His car was well maintained, with all equipment in perfect working order. He'd just had it serviced the previous week. Following standard procedure, he turned on his right blinker, slowly pulled over to the curb, and came to a complete stop in a well-lit area. He turned off the radio, rolled down his window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they would be visible, habits ingrained from both teaching and experiencing countless traffic stops throughout his career. Through his side mirror, he could see the patrol officer approaching, flashlight beam bouncing off the pavement. The beam swept across his license plate, then his side mirror, and finally into his car. The police chief squinted slightly against the bright light, but maintained his calm, professional demeanor. He could feel the familiar weight of his police chief's badge in his jacket pocket, but something made him pause before reaching for it. Years of experience had taught him to read situations, and something about this stop didn't feel routine. The officer's approach was tense, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The police chief had trained hundreds of officers over his career, and he recognized the signs of someone operating on preconceptions rather than protocol. The story was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would not only challenge both men's perspectives, but would ultimately lead to meaningful changes in their department and community. Little did either of them know that this seemingly routine traffic stop would become a powerful lesson in human dignity, professional responsibility, and the ongoing journey toward genuine understanding between law enforcement and the communities they serve. The patrol officer stood at the driver's window, his flashlight beam steady but his voice tense. "License and registration," he demanded, not even bothering with the usual greeting. The police chief noticed how the officer's entire demeanor had shifted the moment the light illuminated his face, a change he'd seen far too many times before, both as a civilian and as an officer. "Good evening, officer," the chief responded calmly, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" His voice remained steady, professional, the voice of someone who'd been on both sides of this interaction countless times. "Your taillight's out," the officer stated firmly, though the chief knew this wasn't true. He checked all his lights just that morning, a habit born from years of routine vehicle inspections. "I understand, but I checked all my lights this morning, and they were working perfectly," the chief replied, maintaining his composed demeanor. "Would you mind if we check them together?" The officer's posture stiffened. "Sir, I said your taillight is out. License and registration now." His right hand had drifted to rest on his holstered weapon, a subtle movement that spoke volumes. The chief slowly reached for his glove compartment, narrating his movements. "I'm reaching for my registration now," he said clearly, noting how the officer tensed at each motion. As he carefully extracted the documents, he could see a second patrol car pulling up in his side mirror. The whole scene was beginning to draw attention. A few residents had come out onto their porches, phones in hand, quietly observing the interaction. The chief knew these moments well. They were the kind that could either escalate into headlines or transform into teaching opportunities. "Here's my registration," he said, holding out the document. "My license is in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for it now, if that's okay." He moved with deliberate slowness, years of experience guiding his actions. The officer snatched the registration, studying it with exaggerated scrutiny. "This vehicle is registered to—" He paused, clearly reading the chief's name and address. Something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, perhaps, but his aggressive stance didn't waver. By now, a third patrol car had arrived, its lights adding to the growing spectacle. The chief could hear radio chatter as more officers arrived on scene. What should have been a simple traffic stop was turning into an impromptu roll call. Through his mirrors, the chief watched as officers conferred behind his car, their gestures suggesting confusion and concern. He recognized several of them from recent departmental meetings, though in the darkness and tension of the moment, they hadn't yet made the connection. The first officer returned to the window, this time with his sergeant in tow. The chief could read the conflict on the sergeant's face, the slow dawning of recognition mixed with growing horror as he realized exactly who they had pulled over. "Sir, step out of the vehicle," the first officer ordered, his voice betraying a slight tremor now. The chief noticed how the sergeant's eyes widened at this command, but he didn't immediately intervene. The chief took a slow, deep breath. He could end this right now by simply showing his badge, but something told him to let this play out a bit longer. Every moment of this stop was teaching him something valuable about his department, about the officers under his command, and about the work that still needed to be done. "Officer," he said calmly, "before I step out, I'd like to understand something. You said my taillight was out, but I know it's working. You've called for multiple units as backup for a simple traffic stop. I've been nothing but cooperative, yet your hand hasn't left your weapon since you approached my vehicle. Can you help me understand why?" The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Behind the first officer, the sergeant had gone completely still, recognition finally clicking into place. Other officers who had gathered nearby began to shuffle uncomfortably as they too began to realize who was sitting in the car. This moment, suspended in the red and blue lights of multiple patrol cars, would soon become a turning point for everyone involved. But for now, the chief simply waited, watching as the first officer struggled with a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond his control. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The patrol officer stood frozen, his hand still resting on his weapon, as more and more neighbors emerged from their homes to watch the scene unfold. The soft murmur of their whispers mixed with the idling engines of police cars and the rhythmic flash of emergency lights. "I asked you a question, officer," the chief repeated calmly, his eyes steady and focused. "Why does a routine traffic stop for a supposedly broken taillight require this much backup?" He gestured slightly toward the growing number of patrol cars surrounding his vehicle. The sergeant took a small step forward, his face now clearly visible in the harsh streetlight. "Sir," he began, his voice carrying a hint of panic, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "Let me handle this," the first officer cut in, clearly unaware that his supervisor had recognized the driver. His voice carried a forced authority now, trying to mask his growing uncertainty. "Sir, your behavior is suspicious, and I'm ordering you one last time to exit the vehicle." The chief could see the sergeant's face contort with anxiety. More officers had gathered around, and a small crowd of residents continued to grow on the sidewalk. Some had their phones out, recording everything. The chief knew this moment would either escalate into a crisis or transform into something meaningful. "Very well," the chief replied, his voice remaining steady. "I'm going to exit the vehicle now. But before I do, I want everyone present to watch this carefully." He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, causing several officers to tense up. "Keep your hands where we can see them," the first officer shouted, now fully drawing his weapon. The sergeant's face went pale. "Officer," the chief said, his voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority, "I'm reaching for my credentials. I want you to see something important." With deliberate slowness, he withdrew his hand, now holding both his driver's license and his police chief's badge. The effect was immediate. The first officer's weapon lowered slightly as confusion washed over his face. Behind him, several other officers took involuntary steps backward. The sergeant looked like he might be sick. "I am your new police chief," he announced, his voice carrying across the now silent scene. "And while this isn't how I planned to demonstrate it, we clearly have some important issues to address in this department." The first officer's face drained of color as the reality of the situation crashed over him. His weapon hand dropped completely to his side, and for a moment he looked like he might simply turn and run. The badge in the chief's hand caught the flashing lights, sending blue and red reflections dancing across the shocked faces of everyone present. "Sir, I didn't," the officer stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating into the night air. "No, you didn't," the chief agreed, now stepping out of his vehicle with the same careful movements he'd been using all along. "You didn't check my taillight before pulling me over. You didn't follow proper procedure for a routine traffic stop. You didn't maintain professional composure when you saw who was behind the wheel. And you certainly didn't consider that your actions tonight would have consequences beyond this moment." The gathered crowd had fallen completely silent, watching the scene unfold like a powerful street theater performance. Even the cricket sounds seemed to have paused in anticipation of what would happen next. "Here's what we're going to do," the chief continued, his voice firm but not unkind. "Everyone except the original officer and his sergeant clear the scene. Return to your regular patrols. We've created enough of a spectacle for one night." As the other officers began to disperse, some throwing sympathetic glances at their colleague, the chief turned to address the small crowd of onlookers. "Folks, I appreciate your concern, but everything is under control now. You can return to your homes knowing that tomorrow we begin making some necessary changes in this department." The chief turned back to the officer, who looked like he was preparing himself for the end of his career. But instead of the explosion of anger he was clearly expecting, the chief simply said, "Meet me in my office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. We have a lot of work to do." The night air felt different now, charged with the potential for change rather than the earlier tension of conflict. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the patrol cars pulled away, the chief stood for a moment in the street, watching the officer and his sergeant return to their vehicle. He knew that tomorrow would mark the beginning of a challenging but necessary transformation in his department. The incident could have ended careers. Instead, it was about to become the catalyst for something much more important: a complete reimagining of how his officers approached their duty to protect and serve all members of their community. The next morning arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation hanging over the police station. Word had spread like wildfire through the department about the previous night's incident. Officers clustered in small groups, whispering among themselves, conversations falling silent whenever someone walked past. At precisely 8 a.m., the officer from the traffic stop stood outside the chief's office, his uniform pressed perfectly, shoes shined to a mirror finish. It was clear he hadn't slept much. Dark circles under his eyes told the story of a long night spent wondering if he still had a career in law enforcement. "Come in," the chief's voice called from inside. The office was surprisingly welcoming in the morning light. A few family photos decorated the desk, alongside a stack of files and a steaming cup of coffee. The chief gestured to a chair. "Take a seat. Would you like some coffee?" The officer shook his head, too nervous to trust his voice. His sergeant sat in another chair, looking equally uncomfortable. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "I spent most of the night reviewing the dashcam footage," the chief began, turning his computer monitor so they could all see it. "I'd like us to watch it together." He pressed play, and they all watched the previous night's events unfold from this new perspective. The footage was damning. Even more telling were the timestamps. The officer had activated his lights just seconds after the chief's car came into view, long before he could have possibly seen any issue with the taillights. The audio captured every word, every tone, every moment of escalation. "Stop there," the chief said as the video showed the arrival of the first backup unit. "What do you see?" The officer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I see myself making mistakes, sir." "Be more specific," the chief prompted, his voice firm but not unkind. "Walk me through your decision-making process. What made you decide to pull over my vehicle?" The silence stretched for several long moments. The officer's hands twisted in his lap as he struggled to find the right words. Finally, he looked up, meeting the chief's eyes for the first time that morning. "I saw a nice car in what I considered a questionable neighborhood," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And when I saw who was driving..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The chief leaned forward. "Go on. Say it. We need to get everything out in the open if we're going to fix this." "When I saw a black man behind the wheel, I made assumptions," the officer finished, his face flushing with shame. "I've done it before. We all have. We don't talk about it." The sergeant shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but the chief held up a hand to keep him silent. "Continue. What else do you see in this footage?" "I see myself escalating a situation that didn't need to be escalated. I see myself calling for backup when there was no threat. I see myself..." He paused, swallowing hard. "I see myself with my hand on my weapon, ready to draw on an unarmed man who had done nothing wrong." The chief nodded slowly, letting the weight of these admissions fill the room. Outside his office window, the morning sun cast long shadows across the department parking lot where officers were arriving for the day shift. "Here's what I see," the chief finally said, turning the monitor back around. "I see a teaching opportunity. I see a chance to make real change. And I see an officer who, despite his mistakes, might be brave enough to help make that change happen." Both the officer and sergeant looked up in surprise. This wasn't the career-ending conversation they'd been expecting. "Sir?" the officer questioned, confusion clear in his voice. "I'm not going to fire you," the chief stated plainly. "That would be easy, but it wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I'm going to give you a choice. You can either accept a transfer to another department, where you'll probably continue the same patterns that led to last night's incident, or you can stay here and help me fix the underlying problems that caused it." The officer sat up straighter, a glimmer of hope crossing his face. "What exactly are you proposing, sir?" The chief pulled out a folder he prepared earlier that morning. "I'm creating a new training program, one that addresses the biases we all carry but rarely acknowledge. One that teaches real community policing, not just as a concept, but as a daily practice. And I want you to help lead it." "Me?" The officer's voice cracked with disbelief. "But after what I did..." "Precisely because of what you did," the chief interrupted. "Who better to teach about the dangers of unconscious bias than someone who's faced their own? Who better to help other officers recognize and change their patterns than someone who's been forced to confront them head-on?" The morning light continued to fill the office as the three men discussed the details of this unexpected proposal. Outside, the daily rhythm of the police station continued, unaware that a fundamental change was being set in motion behind the chief's closed door. The news of what happened during the traffic stop spread through the department like a wildfire, but what happened next surprised everyone even more. Instead of firing the officer or sweeping the incident under the rug, the chief called for a mandatory department-wide meeting in the main conference room. The room was packed that morning, with officers standing along the walls because all the seats were taken. The air felt heavy with tension and uncertainty. Some officers stared at their coffee cups, while others whispered among themselves, stealing glances at the officer involved in the incident, who sat in the front row. The chief walked in, carrying a laptop and a thick folder. He didn't start with a lecture or angry words. Instead, he dimmed the lights and played the complete dashcam footage on the large screen. The room fell silent as they watched the events unfold. When the video ended, the chief left the lights off for a moment. "Keep your hands up if you've never made assumptions about someone based on how they look," he said into the darkness. When the lights came back on, not a single hand was raised. "I'm not here to shame anyone," the chief continued, his voice firm but understanding. "I'm here because what happened last night is a wake-up call. It's easy to point fingers, to say I would never do that. But the truth is, we all carry biases. The real question is, what are we going to do about it?" He pulled up another slide showing statistics from their own department: traffic stops, arrests, use of force incidents. The numbers told a story that made many officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Look at these numbers," the chief said. "Really look at them. This isn't about one traffic stop or one officer. This is about patterns we've all been part of, patterns we might not even realize we're creating." The officer from the incident stood up, his voice shaky but determined. "Chief, may I say something?" After receiving a nod, he turned to face his colleagues. "I spent the whole night thinking about what I did. I could make excuses, say I was being cautious, following protocol. But the truth is, I saw what I expected to see, not what was actually there." His honesty seemed to break some invisible barrier in the room. Other officers began sharing their own experiences, times they'd made snap judgments, moments they regretted, situations that could have been handled differently. The chief let the conversation flow, watching as his officers began to open up about things they'd never discussed before. When the room finally quieted down, he unveiled his plan. "Starting today, we're creating a new type of training program," he announced. "Not just another PowerPoint presentation about policies and procedures, but real, honest conversations about why we do what we do and how we can do it better." He explained how the program would work: ride-alongs with officers from different backgrounds, community meetings where citizens could share their experiences, review sessions where they'd analyze body camera footage together and discuss alternative approaches. "And here's the part that might surprise you," the chief added, gesturing to the officer from the traffic stop. "Officer Williams here will be helping to lead this program, because sometimes the best teacher is someone who's learned from their mistakes." The room erupted in murmurs of surprise. The officer who had pulled over the chief was going to help lead the training, but as the chief explained his reasoning, heads began to nod in understanding. "We have two choices," the chief continued. "We can either pretend these biases don't exist and keep making the same mistakes, or we can face them head-on and learn from them. I'm choosing the second option. Who's with me?" One by one, officers began raising their hands. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The energy in the room had shifted from tension to something else. Hope, maybe, or determination. The meeting ran well over its scheduled time as officers continued sharing ideas and suggestions. The chief watched as his department began to transform right before his eyes. This wasn't just about fixing one incident, it was about changing an entire culture. As the meeting wound down, one veteran officer spoke up from the back of the room. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in 20 years on the force, this is the first time we've really talked about these things. Really talked, I mean. Not just nodded along to a training video." The chief smiled. "Then it's about time we started," he replied. "Because this is just the beginning." As officers filed out of the room, there was a sense that something important had shifted. The incident that could have torn the department apart was instead bringing them together, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths and work toward real solutions. The officer who had pulled the chief over was the last to leave. He paused at the door, turning back with a question in his eyes. "Chief," he said quietly, "do you really think we can change things?" The chief looked at him thoughtfully. "That depends," he answered. "Are you ready to do the hard work?" The officer straightened his shoulders and nodded. "Yes, sir, I am." "Then yes," the chief replied. "We can change things. And we're going to start right now." The morning after the departmental meeting, sunlight streamed through the chief's office window as he reviewed the dashboard camera footage one more time. Each viewing reinforced his conviction that this incident could become a turning point for the entire department. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. News of the traffic stop and his unusual response had spread quickly through law enforcement circles. Some chiefs from neighboring districts called to question his judgment, while others wanted to learn more about his approach. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. The officer from the traffic stop stood there, looking more composed than the previous day, but still carrying the weight of recent events in his posture. "You wanted to see me, Chief." "Come in," the chief gestured to the chair across from his desk. "How are you holding up?" The officer sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Honestly, I barely slept. I keep replaying that night in my head, thinking about how differently it could have ended." The chief nodded, pulling out a thick folder from his desk drawer. "That's exactly what we need to talk about. I've spent the morning drafting a new training program, but I need your help to make it work." He spread several documents across his desk, statistics on traffic stops, community feedback forms, and training protocols from departments across the country. "This isn't just about one incident anymore. We're going to transform how our officers interact with the community." The training program they designed over the next few hours was unlike anything the department had seen before. Instead of dry lectures about policy, they created interactive sessions where officers would experience traffic stops from the civilian perspective. They planned community forums where residents could share their experiences openly. Word spread quickly through the department about the changes taking place. Some officers were skeptical at first, viewing it as just another mandatory training to endure. But as the first sessions began, something unexpected happened. Officers started sharing their own stories, times they'd made assumptions, moments they regretted, situations that haunted them. The officer from the traffic stop led these discussions, his honesty about his own mistakes, creating a safe space for others to open up. They brought in community leaders who shared personal experiences of being profiled. The room fell silent as a respected local business owner described being pulled over 3 times in 1 week while driving his luxury car. A high school teacher talked about having to teach her teenage sons how to survive traffic stops. The breakthrough moment came during a role reversal exercise. Officers experienced what it felt like to be pulled over by someone who had already decided they were suspicious. The tension, the fear, the helplessness, it changed perspectives in ways no lecture ever could. 6 months into the program, the statistics started showing promising changes. Complaints about racial profiling dropped significantly. But more importantly, officers reported feeling better equipped to handle their interactions with the public. The chief's office became a hub for honest conversations. Officers would stop by to discuss challenging situations they'd encountered, seeking guidance rather than hiding their uncertainties. The culture of silence was slowly being replaced by one of openness and learning. The officer who had stopped the chief became one of the program's most effective advocates. His willingness to share his story, to admit his mistakes, and show how he was working to change, inspired others to do the same. Community members noticed the difference too. At a town hall meeting, an elderly resident stood up to share how a recent traffic stop had been the most respectful interaction she'd ever had with law enforcement. The officer explained everything he was doing, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. He treated me like a person, not a suspect. As the program grew, other departments began sending observers to learn from their approach. The chief and his team were invited to speak at law enforcement conferences, sharing their experience of turning a potential crisis into an opportunity for genuine change. The most powerful moments were often the quietest ones, when an officer would pull the chief aside to share how the training had changed their approach, or when a community member would stop by the station just to say thank you. 1 year after the incident, the department hosted a community celebration. The officer who had pulled the chief over gave a speech that left many in tears. He talked about how one mistake had led him to confront his own biases and become a better officer. Looking out at the mixed crowd of officers and community members chatting and laughing together, the chief realized they had created something special. They hadn't just changed policies or procedures, they had changed hearts and minds. Sometimes, he told a reporter who asked about the program's success, the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes. The real test isn't whether we make them, it's what we choose to do about them afterward. A year and a half after the traffic stop incident, the police station's break room was buzzing with excitement. Officers gathered around the TV mounted on the wall, watching live coverage of their department receiving a national award for innovative community policing. On screen, the chief and the officer who had once pulled him over stood side by side. Looking back, the officer said during his acceptance speech, his voice steady and sincere, "That night could have ended my career. Instead, it gave me a new purpose." The room fell silent as everyone listened to his words. The changes in the department went far beyond statistics and awards. You could see it in the little things, the way officers greeted people on their beats, the increased number of community members who stopped by the station just to chat, the childhood dream of becoming a police officer returning to young people's conversations. Their training program had spread to 30 other departments across the country. Every week, the chief received calls from police leaders asking how they could implement similar changes. The officer who had stopped him had become a sought-after speaker at police academies, sharing his story with new recruits. But the real proof of change came from the community itself. Local businesses that had once posted "No Cops" signs now offered free coffee to officers on patrol. Neighborhood watch meetings, once tense and confrontational, had transformed into collaborative planning sessions. The chief remembered a particularly touching moment from the previous week. He had been getting coffee when an elderly woman approached him, tears in her eyes. She shared how her grandson, who had always feared the police, now wanted to become an officer like the ones who play basketball with us in the park. The department's annual community picnic, once a sparsely attended formality, had become the biggest event of the year. Officers and residents competed in friendly sports matches, shared meals, and most importantly, shared stories. The barriers between us and them were slowly dissolving. The officer who had sparked this transformation had changed the most. Gone was the defensive, aggressive patrolman. In his place stood a thoughtful leader who helped other officers recognize and overcome their own biases. He had recently been promoted to lead the department's community engagement division. One morning, the chief arrived at his office to find a letter from a national police reform organization. They wanted to document the department's journey and use it as a model for departments nationwide. As he read through their proposal, he couldn't help but smile at how far they'd come. The letter brought him back to that night, standing in the glow of flashing lights, watching an officer struggle with his own prejudices. Who could have known that one traffic stop would lead to such profound changes? That afternoon, during a regular briefing, a rookie officer raised her hand. "Chief," she said, "I heard you tell the story about the traffic stop at the academy. But what made you handle it the way you did? Why didn't you just fire him?" The chief leaned against his desk, considering her question carefully. "Because firing him would have been easy," he replied. "It would have made headlines for a day or two, but it wouldn't have changed anything. Sometimes the hardest path is the one that leads to real change." The department's walls now displayed photos from community events alongside the usual official portraits. Children's artwork hung in the briefing room, drawings of smiling officers helping people, each one a testament to changing perceptions. Their success hadn't come without challenges. Some officers had resisted the changes, preferring to transfer to other departments. Others had struggled to adapt but stuck with it, inspired by the visible improvements in community relations. The local news did a special report marking the anniversary of the incident. They interviewed residents, officers, and community leaders about the changes they'd witnessed. One teenager's comment particularly stood out. "Before, we used to run when we saw cops coming. Now we wave. That's huge." The chief's vision had expanded beyond his own department. He had started mentoring other police leaders who wanted to implement similar changes. His message was always the same: real change starts with admitting our mistakes and being brave enough to learn from them. As he watched his officers interact with community members during their daily patrols, the chief realized they had created something rare and valuable: a police department that truly served and protected everyone, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. The story of that night's traffic stop was now part of their training manual, but its lesson went far beyond policing. It had become a powerful reminder that sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth if we have the courage to learn from them. Looking back, the chief knew that the true measure of their success wasn't in awards or statistics. It was in the small, daily interactions between officers and community members. It was in the trust that had been rebuilt, the barriers that had been broken down, and the lasting changes that would continue long after that infamous traffic stop had faded from memory.